just to let you know. Thank you.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the webinar Addressing Power Imbalance in Global Supply Chains. My name is Namit Agarwal, and I work as the Social Transformation Lead at the World Benchmarking Alliance, or WBA. WBA is thrilled to co-host this webinar in collaboration with UNDP. I would like to thank our donors, Generation Foundation, and the government of Sweden for supporting this launch. We are excited to have you here today. And as some of you are aware, this event was initially planned as an in-person and hybrid gathering in Dhaka. However, due to unavoidable circumstances, we had to transition to a fully online format. The roundtable discussions scheduled for earlier today have been postponed, and we will keep you informed about the scheduled dates. Now, before we delve into the content, let's go over some essential instructions to ensure that everyone can make the most of the webinar today. As you know, we are using the Zoom webinar platform, and only the speakers will have the ability to unmute and come on video. There is a dedicated Q&A section, and there will be dedicated Q&A time after each session. You can submit your questions using the Q&A section, and we'll do our best to address them either through the Q&A section itself via text, or one of the speakers would address these questions. Let me go briefly over the agenda for today. We'll start with the context setting for today's topic, followed by the presentation of WBA's corporate human rights benchmark and the gender benchmark. After that, we have two insightful panel discussions lined up. So without further ado, I will now hand over to Dr. Harpreet Kaur from UNDP to set the context for today's webinar. Before I do that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Harpreet. Dr. Harpreet Kaur is a business and human rights specialist at the UNDP's Regional Bureau of Asia and the Pacific. She oversees UNDP's regional program to promote responsible business practices through partnerships in Asia. Harpreet, over to you.
Thanks, Namit, and greetings, everyone. Indeed, we are delighted to co-host this webinar today, and really sorry that this is happening all virtual, but we do hope to come back to Dhaka and be able to do at least the roundtables in the next couple of months. Let's see. Indeed, Namit, in fact, I was reading sort of the findings from the benchmarks and the findings from the 2023 Gender and Corporate Human Rights Benchmark really affirms the convergence of the crisis and the challenges that we're confronting today. These challenges, as we all know, span geographical, environmental, social, and humanitarian dimensions. But also, looking at the urgency, scale, and impact of these ever-evolving conflicts, surging inflation, disruption in supply chains, climate-induced disasters, human displacement, and disregard for human rights and women's rights are growing exponentially, making the global economic recovery even more precarious and uneven. We just now have really 7 years remaining to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, and unfortunately, as a global society, we are not on track. Now, if we do want to address these polycrises effectively, we must focus on concerted efforts. And I think in doing so, the role of private sector couldn't be more paramount in addressing these crises, but also to sort of looking at the global economy, for they contribute significantly to economic growth, job creation, innovation, and overall prosperity. However, the private sector's influence on economy is not without its own challenges, including concerns related to corporate governance, environmental sustainability, and social responsibility. The growing emphasis on ethical, social, and environmental consideration in business value chains reflects a shift in the way businesses are perceived and expected to operate in the society. And I think we must acknowledge the encouraging progress on responsible business conduct and corporate accountability, particularly in the last decade, with voluntary and mandatory frameworks introduced to strengthen transparency and accountability of companies. But more recently, we've also seen that in addition to these legislations and other policy measures and developments, I think civil society rights organizations are using other strategies and approaches, or pressure points, as we tend to call them, to hold businesses accountable to their human rights impacts. Now, these pressure points could range could range from shareholder activism to media advocacy, complaints mechanisms to UN special procedures, and so on. But I think more recently, we've really seen how benchmarking has become another valuable tool For companies can use it to assess, improve, and align their conduct, performance, and practices with industry norms, best practices, but also stakeholder expectations. And I think it provides those elements also for stakeholder engagement to sort of look at, how do you connect with the communities in itself as well. At the same time, we have seen civil society and human rights defenders to use benchmark in advocating responsible business conduct in an ever-evolving business landscape. UNDP is an ally of the World Benchmarking Alliance, and we're really happy to collaborate with co-organize with World Benchmarking Alliance this launch of the 2023 Corporate Human Rights Benchmark and the Gender Benchmark, as well as our policy briefs on pressure points to secure access to justice for corporate human rights abuse. I'll let Sophia, our colleague, to sort of specify and provide more information on the benchmark. But just to give you a brief introduction, that the World Benchmarking Alliance was created 5 years ago to measure corporate performance and to hold businesses accountable for their contribution to the SDGs and Paris Agreement. Indeed, the corporate human rights benchmarking has emerged as a popular tool for evaluating corporate adherence to human rights obligations, as well as part of the wider ecosystem of access to justice and corporate accountability for rights holders. At UNDP, we've been working and collaborated with the Macquarie universities to set up an Access to Justice Lab and develop policy briefs to strengthen corporate accountability. And we're looking at particularly, different what we call as pressure points as the engagement windows to trigger action on the part of corporations to take seriously the concerns of affected stakeholders, but also try to address those concerns in a meaningful manner. I know that we do have among us Professor Surya Deva from Macquarie University, and I would like to acknowledge this collaboration with them, with the Macquarie University, where we are co-developing these policy briefs, and benchmarking and shareholder activism are two of the policy briefs that we would be able to have conversations in the later sessions today. And I look forward to hearing more about some of these pressure points in the conversation at the second panel of the day. But before that, let me hand over to our colleague, Sophia Delval, Engagement Leads Social Transformation with the World Benchmarking Alliance, to present the key findings of the 2023 Gender Benchmark and Corporate Human Rights Benchmark. Thank you, everyone. And Sophia, over to you.
Thank you so much, Harpreet. And let me just share my screen right now. I hope that everyone can see the slides right now. So, first of all, it's such an honor to be here with many of you. As I think Namit and Harpreet had said already, I really wished I could have been with so many of you in Dhaka, but hopefully I'll meet you there soon enough. I have the honor to present to you the findings of the gender benchmark and the CHRB that we're launching just now, actually available on our website. But I first want to take a moment to acknowledge that I'm just kind of representing the work of many of my colleagues here. So I want to also thank our colleagues Samita, Sanjini, Hernando, Viviana, Annabelle, Jill, Hannah, Rachel, Namet, and Melinda that work very hard on delivering these benchmarks to you. So like behind every product we have, behind every work, there's also people behind these benchmarks as well. As Harpreet already mentioned, WBA, what we do, as our name says, is that we develop free and publicly available benchmarks to compare and measure company performance on the SDGs. And the way we do this is that instead of having maybe one benchmark per SDG, we identified some of the main topics and the main transformations where the corporate sector has a particular role to play in advancing progress or in hindering progress. And at the heart of our model that you see here at the right, we have the social transformation, recognizing that social is basically a fundamental issue that underlines any other transformation that needs to happen for a more sustainable and equitable future. And within the social transformation, we're going to put a spotlight on two particular topics that we see as really catalytic to advance more fair and more equitable society. One is human rights, which we're focusing on through our corporate human rights benchmark, or CHRB, and the other one is gender equality. To give you a very quick sense of how the WBA creates benchmarks, because I know this is our questions that we get very often, we are trying here to provide a kind of objective third-party assessment of what companies are disclosing. In this sense, this is not a survey that companies are kind of voluntarily taking, and it's also, in that sense, not kind of us creating a few new reporting standards, but instead of that, we're using existing standards like the ILO standards, the UN guiding principles, like the women empowerment principles, as well as reporting standards such as the GRI, to then compare and measure how companies do on these topics. And the process we have follows these 5 phases. So first, we notify companies that they're going to be assessed. We have on in-house or with research partners, we carry an initial assessment based on publicly available information. And then we send that first draft assessment to the companies that then have an opportunity to review and provide feedback. Following that, we take that feedback into account. We have an evaluation phase where the team internally evaluates and finalizes the company assessment. And finally, we get to the day of today, to publication, where we publish our benchmark. And we encourage all stakeholders to use these results. So now if you actually go to the WBS website, you should be able to see the ranking of all of the companies on the CHRB and the gender benchmark, as well as our insights, our main findings that I'm going to first walk you through. So don't spoil yourself. I'm going to talk you through them, but if you want to see them later, you can also access them on our website. So the 2 benchmarks we're launching today in parallel are 2 people-centered benchmarks that sit within the social transformation. This is the first time we're launching them together, and it's because we saw an opportunity to get in a wider lens on how the private sector is doing on social issues more generally, and also how the gender and human rights issues clearly intersect as well. On one end, we have the 2023 gender benchmark that is assessing 112 of the largest apparel and food and agriculture companies. The apparel sector is being assessed for the second time. It was assessed the first time in 2021, while the food and agriculture sector is being assessed for the first time in the gender benchmark. Additionally, we also had a much broader advanced scale assessment of 1,006 companies across 10 sectors that allows us to have a state of play of how the private sector is doing on gender equality. And on the gender benchmark, you will see here at the bottom left that we have a breakdown of what the methodology includes. So basically, what are some of the topics we're looking in companies and how they're disclosing, having policies, practices on these topics. So we have governance strategy, representation, compensation and benefits, health and well-being, violence and harassment, and marketplace and community. While on the right, we have the 2023 CHRB, that's ranking 110 of the largest apparel and extractive companies for the 5th time in both cases. So that allows us to also see a trend, what has happened since they were first assessed to this date. Last year, you may be aware in 2022 that we assessed 3 additional sectors, the ICT, manufacturing, automotive manufacturing, and the food and agriculture sector. And those findings are also available on our website. And the methodology of the CHRB covers governance and policies, how to embed respect for human rights and implement human rights due diligence, issues of remedy and grievance mechanisms, performance on salient human rights issues for the sectors assessed, and then also responses to serious allegations. So let's start with the findings. Opening with gender, and I'm sad to say that I'm starting well, so maybe not the best news. We found that when we assessed the data of the 1,000 companies we were assessing, 1,006 companies we were assessing, we found that the average score is 17%. This is a very grim picture in the sense that as you see on the image on the right, you're only seeing that barely 2 companies are actually above the 50% mark of the total score. Most companies are stuck at the beginning of the road. There's 12% of the companies we assessed that actually score 0 across all indicators in terms of gender. In terms of, for example, representation, which is one of the topics that has been most covered when trying to advance gender equality in the workplace, we find that still in 44% of the companies, women are underrepresented across all levels of leadership, from middle management to C-suite to the board. And only 3 companies actually have gender balance, so between 40 and 60% of women across all levels of leadership. On the other hand, when we want to take a picture of what are some of the top performers doing that maybe could be an inspiration for other companies to step up and move ahead on the road, we find that the top 100 companies of this 1,006 tend to have a public commitment to gender equality and also addressed unpaid care. So, of course, you would imagine that the top performing companies tend to do better across the board. However, in these 2 particular topics, we saw that the difference was really significant. So as you see on the image here on the right, the top 100 companies, 73% of them had a public commitment to gender equality and women's empowerment versus 20% of the remaining 906. And also 59% of the 200 companies had a policy of childcare and family support versus 20% of the other 906. One thing to note here as well is that having a public commitment, in many cases, actually in 86% of the cases that companies have a public commitment, it is assigning the women empowerment principles of the UN. And in that sense, we're happy to see that many companies not only sign in paper a commitment, but then, as we see in their scores in the benchmarks, are taking this following steps to actually implement this into practice. The next finding on terms of gender is regarding to unpaid care and parental leave. What we're finding is that in general, companies treat parental leave as a benefit offered to some employees and not a right for all. It's important to notice that the ILO and the UN recognize maternity leave as a fundamental labor right. But at this point, only 36% of the companies that we assessed had some sort of maternity leave policy disclosed, and only 31% had a paternity leave policy. And as you see in the image of the right, of those 36%, actually only 9% offer this to all employees globally, while others actually only offer it to some of their employees. It's also important to note that only 7% of the companies that have some sort of maternity leave policy actually meet the standard recommended by the ILO, which is a minimum of 14 weeks of maternity leave. And there's even less support and protection of mothers and parents down the supply chain. We actually found that when we're taking a deep dive into the 112 companies we assessed on the apparel and food sectors, none of them actually require their suppliers to provide parental leave. In this sense, we see that both the provision of maternity leave and paternity leave, or primary and secondary care leave, it's a key issue to actually advancing gender equality in both allowing kind of redistributing and recognizing and supporting the care work that both parents have. And also, I think it's important not to just focus on the role of the birthing parent, the mother, but also ensuring that fathers as well are able to and encouraged to take an active role in caregiving and actually balance the care responsibilities in the process. Apologies. Finally, also on gender, in terms of a really key topic, which is violence and harassment, we find that while most companies prohibit violence and harassment, very few really take steps to prevent and remediate it. This is very concerning because we know that 1 in 5 people in employment globally are experiencing violence and harassment at work, according to the ILO, or have experienced. However, the gap between prohibiting and actually taking steps to enable remediation, it's really massive. In terms of the 4%, where we're basically seeing when we see a 4% has a clear remediation process, when we're talking about that, we're saying, do companies have a process in terms of understanding what is the outcome that could happen? What would happen to perpetrators? How is the whistleblower going to be protected? But we see very few companies actually outlining this. And these poor results are actually consistent with some of the reasons for underreporting grievances in terms of violence and harassment, which is basically people thinking it's going to be a wasted effort, or there's going to be retribution and a problem with their own reputation, or the procedures are actually unclear, so they're not going to be seeing any outcomes, so it's going to be risky for themselves. Then switching to the CHRV, and then I'm going to actually go to the end for a finding that actually brings both benchmarks together. The CHRV shows us that after assessing the sector's apparel and extractives for 5 years, 70% of them have improved their scores on key human rights indicators. So there's a glimpse of hope. Once you actually put the spotlight on some of the companies, they do change. And there's a group of 12 companies that actually has improved their score by 5 times the average. So we look at these companies in particular to see what do they have in common, where do they change, and what we saw is that most of them now have an allocation of senior responsibility for day-to-day management of human rights issues. They're also providing training and capacity building for their teammates, assess their salient human rights risks, and have grievance mechanisms for external stakeholders. We see these first topics that I mentioned in terms of having clear responsibilities for human rights and also providing training as key elements to actually perform better overall on human rights, because the companies that in general do both of this, so having people assigned to deal with human rights and training human rights, perform 150% better in the benchmark than other companies. this also makes sense, right? Having the team in place, having the resources, having the capacity building, then enables you actually to really translate your commitment to respect human rights into practice. On the other hand, we find that while companies are having more human rights due diligence processes and also more grievance mechanisms, too many still fail to include rights holders in the processes. So as you see in the image here on the right, 61% of companies on this benchmark disclose taking at least one or more steps of human rights due diligence. This is up from 51% in 2018, but only 27% of them disclose any way that they involve rights holders in the process. Similarly, when it comes to grievance mechanisms, we find that 91% of companies have a grievance mechanism and kind of for their own workers. 76% have a grievance mechanism for external stakeholders, but very few actually ensure rights holder ownership by involving them in the design of the mechanism. And very few also kind of ensure that there's trust for rights holder by actually being transparent when it comes to predictability, what are the outcomes, what are the processes, in a very similar way to what I was referring to when it comes to the violence and harassment finding as well. Finally, this is a finding that we were able to do while bringing both benchmarks together. The common sector we had for the CHRV and the gender benchmark this year is the apparel sector, and this is why also we're going to have a panel that focuses in the apparel sector in Bangladesh itself. And what we found that when we assessed 55 companies, both on human rights and on gender, is that there's a mismatch between what companies' expectations are in terms of gender and human rights on their suppliers and how they actually enable their suppliers to meet these expectations. So while we have that 83% of companies have some sort of expectations on their suppliers on human rights and gender equality, for example, 85% of companies declare that when they contract suppliers, they factor human rights issues. 87% of companies say that they include at least one gender-related kind of clause in their contractual agreements. However, only half of the companies have some targeted support. This could be one program with a few suppliers, for example, on gender equality or human rights issues. And only 27% actually enable their suppliers to meet their expectations through responsible purchasing practices, like, for example, not delaying payments or avoiding short notice requirements. In this sense, suppliers are facing really high expectations, but actually set to fail by the lack of really supportive practices to enable them to deliver. So overall, we'd like to say the picture shows us really what the magnitude of the challenge, right? And the urgency of the challenge. We have a really significant gap, as Harpreet was mentioning. We're nowhere on track of delivering the SDGs. At the same time, after doing 5 years of the CHRV, we do find that change is possible, and change and fast change is possible as well. So companies are able to actually radically transform, go from the bottom of the ranking and benchmark to actually closer to the top of the ranking by setting the resources, prioritizing, and supporting their internal teams in actually delivering this change. And we are committed as well to work with all stakeholders to accelerate this progress, both on human rights and gender equality. We like basically our benchmarks not to be gathering dust in these virtual shelves that could be our website. We want our resources to be supporting and enabling the work of every stakeholder, and also for us to actively work and collaborate. So first of all, to mention, I think, as I said at the beginning, all of our resources, our insights, reports, our rankings, our data, our methodologies are free and publicly available, are a public good available for everyone to use. Our ally Oxfam is launching actually a paper tomorrow on valuing women's work, where they're actually using some of the insights from the 1006 companies on gender equality. We invite you to also keep an eye on that. But also we're going to be working with our allies on these 4 things that I have here. First of all, during 2024, we're going to be delivering further insights, both on the 5-year trends of the 5 sectors we assessed on CHRV over the last few years, and also on some of the main insights that are coming from the gender data. We have also been having a collective impact coalition where we work with our allies from civil society, investors, and business platforms to drive change. So far, we have been focusing mostly on human rights due diligence, and next year we aim at starting one collective impact coalition focused on gender. So please reach out if you're interested in connecting on this. We also create communities of practice for companies that engage in the benchmark, for them to do some peer learning and bring some expertise as well, understand how to advance in this journey. And finally, In 2024, we're going to be launching a social benchmark, which is going to be assessing all 2,000 companies in scope for WBA on some of the fundamental topics of social issues, including human rights, decent work, and ethical conduct. This will be around HLPF next year, so please stay tuned for that one as well. Thank you so much, and Harpreet, over to you.
Thanks, Sophia. Indeed, not many of these findings are very encouraging, but as you said, this is a journey and we're sort of looking at how we can indeed use benchmarking as a tool to promote responsible business agenda and corporate accountability as well. I see there are some questions here in the Q&A. Some of these have been answered. So, I think there was one question on methodology, which Salia already answered. But I think one of the key questions, Sophia, that has come up is, I'm now seeing if it's going to answer. No. So one of the questions from Miley Lee is for those companies which have remediation, what kind of mechanism they have and what we can learn from them. So if you have any quick reflections, I know we don't have a lot of time for this, but if you have any quick reflections on what kind of grievance mechanisms or remediation that the businesses are looking at, and if you can, what are the learnings that the participating companies or the stakeholders who are online today could take away those learnings from them? So over to you.
Thank you, Harpreet. Miley, I need to admit that top of mind, I wouldn't want to give you kind of a biased one example that would come to top of mind. So I think what would be best is that if you want to then go to our website and filter what are the companies that are scoring well on these topics of remediation, you can see many different kinds of examples there. And I think that's better than, because myself as well, kind of, I'm working at this high level of delivering this, but the team that really was working at assessing each company and their examples is the research team that's able to actually see this level of detail. So I hope that maybe there's a way of responding this and following up with a more comprehensive list of how companies are delivering this remediation, maybe via email. So please reach out to us on that.
Sure. Thanks, Sophia. There's another question on, do we know how many of these assessed companies are from Bangladesh and how many are these from China? It's a question from Manira Mani.
Thank you. So I think I need to check actually my notes, but I think none are from Bangladesh. But what we did is when we mapped how many of these companies actually source from Bangladesh, it was about 50% of them. So what we're assessing, I think, to give you a sense, is in general the biggest brands and fashion brands in terms of gender equality on this topic. So many of them are based in China, in Europe, and in the US. But most of them have some sourcing ties to Bangladesh. The number of how many Chinese companies are there, you can probably find it in our report. I, again, apologize for not having it right here. And I'm going to ask my colleagues to maybe help us respond to that in the chat as well.
Sure. Thanks, Sophia. And I see that colleagues have joined online and, they're also responding to some of these questions, particularly on the methodology, number of companies, but also sort of the geographical spread of the companies. So I think keep an eye on the answered questions and you should be able to find more information. But I would strongly encourage everyone to go to the website and have a look at the benchmark, the report. But also, I think there's a question on if, Sophia, your presentation would be shared via an email today. But just to say, that at the end of the webinar, we will send out an email with the recording for the webinar, which will also include, in fact, the key findings, which is what Sophia just presented. So you would have access to a summary of the key findings as well, in case, you want to have a look at the findings first and then go on to the detailed report. But thank you very much. I'm just cautious of the time, and there's one question which kind of stands out and maybe, not very not sort of looking at directly at the question on benchmarks, but Sophia, there's a question on, if you think it's important that women stand up for themselves rather than waiting for the human resource department or any other respective department to resolve the issue when they're target of harassment, and what could be the best mechanism? And I know it's kind of a more broad overarching question, not looking at the benchmark specifically, but if you have any quick reflections on, any experiences or any cases that you may want to highlight from the gender benchmark, particularly on sexual harassment and data on that, that'd be great. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I can answer from that as a woman myself, and then as a person that works for the World Benchmarking Alliance, right? I think it's hard for us to know where people are and kind of where the situation is in terms of because if they face violence and harassment, that may affect people in different ways, right? So in some cases, people may feel like they actually have the assertiveness or the capacity of stepping up. But I think putting that burden on the person when the system is not really enabling them to speak up, it's not fair. And our role as WBA and another role of UNDP, BPSHR here, is to advise what companies should be doing to enable people to be able to step up, regardless of whether they're, someone really, I don't know, that is really brave or is really able to step up, or someone that's actually more introverted. I feel like I'm not using the right words here, but I think you know what I'm saying, right? Like, I don't think we can put in the individual responsibility to step up regardless. I think the responsibility for enabling and having the right systems. So this is actually a smooth process where you feel safe, where you feel heard, that you know that something's going to happen if you actually raise your voice. It's a responsibility of a company. If we are kind of just putting the burden on someone to be able to speak up for themselves, we're not really recognizing that people may be facing challenges that are invisible for us, and maybe facing kind of more structural challenges as well, because they were kind of subject to violence and harassment themselves. So I'm imagining also others will be able to answer to this question, because I feel like this is more of a, how do we see it? But definitely I would say this is more of a call to action to companies themselves to set the systems.
Thanks, Sophia. And I think with that, we've answered some of the critical questions that were here on the Q&A. Thank you very much for your presentation today. And with that, I would like to hand over back to Namit for the first panel of the day. Namit, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Harpreet, and thanks, Sophia, for the presentation. Indeed, a lot of work yet to do before we can claim that we are anywhere closer to achieving respect for human rights or gender equality. To delve deeper into some of the findings from both the benchmarks, I'm joined by a distinguished panel of speakers. So I'll invite them and request them to switch on their videos and come in the spotlight. First is Kalpana Akhtar, who's the Executive Director for Bangladesh Center for Workers' Solidarity. Next, we have Jennifer Zabar, who's the Director for Social Compliance and Safeguarding for BRAC. And then Sheikh H.M. Mustafiz, who's the Chairman and Standing Committee on Sustainability for BGMEA, which is, I think, the biggest association of garment manufacturers and exporters in Bangladesh. Thanks for joining me here. Jennifer, we are not able to see your video. Hopefully that will be addressed shortly. And we will spend the next 45 minutes to discuss the challenges, opportunities, and solutions for both gender equality and respect for human rights, particularly in the garments sector of Bangladesh. And like Sophia mentioned, the 55 companies that we assessed on human rights and gender, half of them source, and even more maybe, source from Bangladesh. So there's definitely a lot of impact of what these companies do and not do on the stakeholders that the three of you engage with on a day-to-day basis. One of the findings from the benchmarks, like Sophia presented, shows that suppliers are expected to respect human rights and promote gender equality, but are set up to fail by buying companies. Most brands set high standards for their suppliers regarding human rights and gender equality, but very few are able to work with the suppliers and enable the suppliers to meet those expectations through responsible purchasing practices. Issues in Bangladesh garment sector definitely reflect the challenges that also exist in other sectors and supply chains in similar contexts elsewhere. This is, while some of the issues are very, very specific to Bangladesh, maybe there are similar contexts in similar supply chains where similar issues exist. So I think it's also a responsibility and an objective of this conversation to look beyond the Bangladesh and the garment supply chain, because suppliers and workers and communities may be facing similar issues elsewhere as well. And some of the participants in the webinar are also representing some of those contexts. So it might be helpful for them to understand what are those issues and what could be potential solutions as well. Many of the underlying causes of the challenges that we are discussing today are systemic and can neither be solved by a single stakeholder alone, nor they can be solved quickly. So we need to collaborate, we need to work with others, and work consistently to ensure that the rights of millions of workers working in the sector can be protected and respected. So for the panel discussion, I would request all of you to also take a step back and look at the broader issues, look at the challenges, opportunities, and solutions for gender equality and human rights in the long term. So that's the context with which I would like to start. And I see Jennifer is not visible at the moment, but maybe I'll start with the both of you, and hopefully Jennifer can join back. So the first question that I have, which will also give you an opportunity to talk about your own perspective and how do you involve yourself through your organization or individually in addressing some of these issues of gender equality, human rights in the garment sector in Bangladesh. And maybe Kalpana, if you can start with yourself, and you can take about 5 to 7 minutes to just set your perspective of where you are, how do you see yourself, and how do you work with the workers and others on these two specific issues. And then Mustafiz, I would turn to you to respond to the similar question, and hopefully Jennifer will also be online by then. Kalpana, over to you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Namit, for having me as a panelist with other two distinguished guests. I was listening, Sophia very well about the benchmark findings. So my perspectives, it's like pretty clear. I started working as a factory worker in age of 12, and I'm female. So that is totally goes. And last 32 years, basically, I have experienced, and promoting my involvement is very in-depth with these women workers in this sector, to understanding, to promoting and fighting for worker rights in the same time, the gender equality too. So, that is my involvement says that how I'm being here. So what I see in here that when we talk about gender equality, as you know, that the Bangladesh garment sector, it is vast majority are still the women workers. So then it is come that how these industry are treating these women workers, or how the gender equality being looking in this industry. So first thing that we can talk about, the women from the majority of these workers, but often face discriminatory practice, though in terms of the wages, for same work, there is not much discrimination we see. It is very few cases that we see the discrimination for the same work that we have to really admit. Like our women workers could, come to in that point that they can earn same wage for same job. But when we talk about takeaway salary, in that case, there is a wage gap between men and women. Many cases, the men workers do more overtime and the women less. So that is also, reflect on their wages. Low wages is one of the biggest challenge for the gender equality in this sector. As you know, we are in the middle of the wage movement at this moment. When workers are talking and raising their voice to increase the minimum wage. So this being a long-run problem set, which need to be, improved. Otherwise, that one of the challenge for gender equality will be always there. The recent set minimum wage, 12,500, yet is a fall short for workers for their daily necessity. We can talk about poor working condition that comes with so many things in the gender equality, but it has pros and cons. Like when we talk about the poor working condition, but we need to admit that there is a safety improvement has been done. A phenomenal change has been done in the last 10 years. The majority factories are not in a situation of Rana Plaza. It has been improved, and in many cases that we are being a role model to the world at this moment, that how safety can be improved in Rana Plaza to now these days. So that is like we definitely can take credit out of it, and we can take credit to the brands and also our manufacturers on that. But in the same time, enormous gender-based violence exists in these factories. So that is also one of the practical challenge that we have to admit, and we have to talk about that. Otherwise, we cannot demand that, having the vast majority of women, we do have gender equal industry. It's a lack of bargaining capacity in the factory is one of the challenges that I also see in order to gender equality. Like, we can have a number of union, but there is no healthy union practice, and the women participation is not quite enough to women workers to talk about their rights in those bargaining platform. Harassment and abuses is still many of the factories. Verbal abuses exist. Those or for even a minor mistake, throwing the body on the workers, throwing the merchandise on workers' body. That is one kind of physical harassment that we can talk about it. So these all are the perspectives, and I can discuss. And also my involvement is to promote and educate workers, and also to fight to improve this condition that I'm been doing last few decades. So I wanted to stop here and give a chance to other speaker to speak and contribute more. Yeah.
Thanks, Kalpana. And I see Jennifer is, I think, struggling to come back. There is some technical issue. And before I let Mustafiz you come, I would also remind everyone that please use the Q&A section to ask as many questions as you want, so that towards the end, we will have a couple of minutes to respond to those questions. Mustafiz, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me. This is really great to see a lot of known faces. So it is good to be here again. So let me introduce myself again. I am Sheikh H. Mustafiz. I'm the managing director of Q Dress Industry Limited. I run a very medium-sized factory. It's not a big one. And I'm also working in BGME as a chairman of the Standing Committee on Sustainability. So that's what I'm doing right now. So I really appreciate Kalpana's comments that her acknowledgement on the unequal pay and the safety. I really appreciate your kind acknowledgement. And that has really happened in Bangladesh, that I think if we talk about 20 years back, there was the issue with the unequal pay, that women and men are not getting paid right, in equal pay. But it has changed, and now it's all about the skill-based salary. So if you have the skill, you get the right payment. So that is converted, not anymore a gender biased. So that is the good thing. But before I start, going to the other points, I would like to mention you some good news. What is happening in BGME? Probably that will help you out to understand that how far we have been in terms of the gender equality, and also in terms of the human rights. I would like to start with one of the initiatives we have launched in BGMA. It is called Responsible Business Hub. In short, it's called RBH. With the cooperation with GIZ, we launched an initiative. It's a global initiative, actually. So we are part of this global initiative where we are working to make sure that human rights due diligence are in place in the factory, because what is our traditional mechanism is that we used to be always to be certified, audited, and do everything by ticking some boxes, having some some papers. So that was actually our usual practice. But now we are converting ourselves to a new direction that is called the risk-based approach. So we are educating our factories that how we can operate our factories so that we can ensure that the human rights are ensured. Human rights are, it is fully so that we can make the whole industry as a humanitarian factory. So it's not anymore as a money-making machine. It should have all the components based on the risk-based assessment. So that is what we are heading to. It means that we are not only ticking the box, but also trying to find out the loopholes where what is the reason behind of the human rights violation? What is the reason behind the gender inequality? So we are trying to digging up ourselves by our own assessment, trying to find out that how we can get rid of this kind of problem, how we can make a better industry. For example, as Kalpana acknowledged that we become one of the safest R&D industry in the world. Also, we become one of the greenest industry in the world. But also, we want to be the champion in the human rights. I mean, when we are talking about the human rights, Bangladesh R&D industry wanted to be the champion of the human rights delivery. So that is where actually we are heading to. And then I would like to mention that also we have a pledge by 2030. We wanted to ensure that the human rights issues and also the gender equality all are properly addressed, and we have the right practices. And also I'd like to invite World Benchmark Alliance. They can come forward, and we are ready to collaborate with them also to if they wanted to make any survey or any kinds of research with us. We are open. I think they can contact with me, and we are ready to do that, so that we can research and we can find out that where we are missing. I mean, what kind of component we are missing to ensure that we are not practicing any kinds of missing links regarding the gender inequality or any human rights issue. So we are ready to embrace any kinds of cooperation here. For the international initiative, from the international initiative. But I would like to mention a few initiatives we are also in place. For example, we have one of the initiative from UNICEF. It is called Mothers at Work. So we are we are helping the mother who are working in the. There are many programs actually happening with this Mothers at Work program. We also have a nutrition program through GAIN International. It's also another international initiative to ensure the nutrition of the workers. And also we have another program. It's called Moner Bondhu. It's about mental health. So that is also happening in our factories. We also have a higher education program. We have a collaboration with the Asian University of Women in Chittagong. So we are also sending our female workers to get, if anybody wanted to have a higher education, we also have that kind of program. So we are having a lot of things in place that is happening in BGMEA that we wanted to help, and we wanted to make sure that these disparities, especially gender disparities, can be reduced day by day, and we can ensure that the gender equality in the garment industry is in place. So that is I would like to say, and if there is anything need to add, I will add later. Thank you.
Thank you, Mustafis, for sharing your perspective, and thanks, Jennifer. I saw that you were facing some technical challenges, but glad that you are able to join. I think from your phone now. So thanks for joining back. So I think we are at the first question. Just wanting to get a sense of your perspective as an individual, as the organization that you're representing. What is your involvement in addressing gender equality and human rights issues in the garment sector in Bangladesh? And perhaps from your work, if you could also bring in some of the cultural and social norms which kind of intertwine and add to the challenges that the workers and communities are facing.
Okay, thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so if I to answer your questions, we need to see the journey of the RNG sector. So in the RNG sector, when they started in the 80s, it was very much the roles became stereotyped. Managers are men who can lead, and women are the operators who can sew. And I think the crux of the gender issue starts with these perceptions and notions which have continued over decades, even today. If you see the percentages of women in mid-managerial positions, it's much better than before, I must say, because previously it was, we have some people coming in mid-managerial, some women coming in, but the crux of the issue is that throughout the chain of, say, leadership to down to the operators, there is disparity in, say, the women and men ratio. Why has that happened, and why has work not progressed around here? Couple of notions play. Number one is women have to look after children after hours. They have to cook, they have their, that is also stereotyping. They have to cook, they have to look after the children, they have additional responsibilities. So these notions that come in, women will not be able to do mid-managerial positions. Have we created the conducive environment and given, say, the equitable measures so that they can reach? Now, if you look at the history of the RMG sector, women came in the critical mass from the most ruralist of villages in search of work to have a better family. And this they did in the 80s. So, and women have thrived in the industry because they came in the critical mass. So now when we think of women cannot have the additional responsibility, women can't manage, women can't shout, all those aspects that come in is perception. Have we created an environment where in mid-managerial, say supervisory levels, we're taking a critical mass up? Because all the studies and what has come in is that after hours, if a woman goes home later than the rest, then her image, her reputation will be brought at risk. Husbands don't like women, say, staying later and all of those issues. If the critical mass was there, when they went back home, they would be going in the mass. So some equitable measures, I think, are needed. Some perception breaking is needed, not only among, say, mid-managers supporting women who are coming at supervisory levels, but also having the women who are in operator levels accepting women in this role. So I think there's a big sort of perception gap. The industry has made wonderful strides in terms of improvement, in terms of ensuring a lot of things. But I think this is an area where how would you address and how things are addressed? I mean, from BRAC, we support factories through a management process of embedding. So through policies, not just having a gender policy, but how is a gender policy embedded within an organization? And then the other issue is that, am I providing a conducive environment for women to thrive? And on that, we actually work on remediation. So sexual harassment, abuse, the different types. So it can be something very small, like something very verbal, which is very minor, to something very much more severe. In that context, how should organizations approach? I mean, there are different approaches to redressal. So one is that not only that something has come up, but it needs to be addressed. Otherwise, people don't have trust in the system. So it could be addressed through full investigations for severe cases or full inquiries. You could have mediation and feedback mechanisms in place. So these sort of structures need to develop for all, actually, so that you can actually ensure conducive environments for women, for men, for trans, all types of people who come in, that everybody, their aspects are being addressed. So this is something that through a system strengthening BRAC works, from the policy procedures to the risk assessments to the grievance mechanism and monitoring and evaluation. But I think this is something that needs to be owned by each factory, and embedding the gender parameters, like the maternity, like the issue of the issues, like the pay issue is pretty much okay. But the other different parameters where you're having a more conducive environment, daycares, all of those aspects would come in on the gender front. And I think if these can be looked into now with a gender angle, I think many of the workplace issues, which is a worldwide issue, can actually be resolved and sort of setting in processes and mechanisms. I'll stop here for further questions.
Thanks, Jennifer. And thanks all three of you for kind of laying out your perspective and also unpacking the issue, because I think there are so many nuances and so many layers within that, and we are barely scratching the surface in these 45 minutes, but at least a good gist of what are those core issues. And it's also heartening to see that there are different pieces of work happening at the workers level, at the factories level, as well as the community and overall systems level, which are absolutely important to address the issue. But as you all said, these are systemic issues. So we need to also prioritize and see, what are the opportunities that exist and where can some of the work be prioritized. So if I can ask a follow-up question to, again, all three of you in terms of what opportunities do you see from your own perspective to address some of these issues, because these issues are big and audacious, but we need to start somewhere, and it's better to start at a place where we see the maximum opportunity to leverage. So maybe again, if I can go in that order, Kalpana, starting with you, what opportunities exist from your perspective to address gender and human rights issues? So both in the workers in the garment sector.
Okay, so the opportunity, I would say that, let's talk in a different angle, that we need to create an environment to create an opportunity on that. Opportunity definitely is there to make an improve, because when we are talking that it is not gender equality is there, that means that there is a opportunity to improve. The question is that whether do we have that environment to create. So, hearing from Jennifer and hearing from, of course, Mustafi's wife, that says that we do have that environment, but we need to bring some resilience as well. Like, the first of all, whom we are talking about these workers, those are working in this industry. So the first thing, we need to create an enable or bring an enable environment for workers' education. That workers really need to know that what we are talking about when they're fighting with very basic, that my work should be to that hour. I need to get my wages like beginning of that month. Then we are adding that, oh, they might not ready, but there is a scope to get promoted, right, as a supervisor. Okay, so that equality is not there. So in order to do that, we need to bring we need to create an environment for that, as well as we need to educate these workers and women as well. There is a huge opportunity to bring or create a discussion table or negotiating table in the respective factories or the respective workplaces. It is needed, okay? Yes, we can talk about gender equality as a whole, but those need to discuss in-house as well. So that discussion is missing at this moment. The opportunity we can talk about that there is a huge opportunity to create or reform the law to enable the gender equality in a real world of the workplace. I think those opportunities is there, and we just need to enable the environment on that, talk on that, and making it real, not like talking on the webinar or talking among ourselves for many years. I think we just need to do that action. Yeah, over to you, Naveen.
Thanks so much, Kalpana, and totally agree that, I mean, talking on webinars is definitely not enough, but the idea is to also start some of these conversations and then take those conversations deeper. Coming to you, Mustafiz, and also trying to take one of the questions which is in the Q&A, and while you're addressing the question on opportunities, if you can also look at the EU legislation on mandatory human rights due diligence, and whether you see that as an opportunity. If yes, how do you see that playing at the suppliers level in the Garments Manufacturers Association?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, actually, it is true that it is an opportunity for us, because there is a lot of room for improvement. We can do a lot for sure, but there are some, I mean, there are some reality we also need to understand. For example, in garment industry, it is sorry to say that still our educated women, they are not coming that much in the garment industry, because we are I mean, most of the women are working in the garment industry has less education than the educated women. So that is one of the reason probably the number of percentage of women in the higher position is less. So this is one of the things. So if we can get more educated people, to then probably the number of female supervisor or maybe in higher position can be more and more. So that is all of the things. But secondly, also we can do some training program. We can make some kind of education system that so that they can have the skills and they can also have the leadership quality. So that is also can be done, and that is what we are actually doing. It is not that we are not doing it. It is doing it on the job training, and there are a lot of awareness training, a lot of skill development training, a lot of things are happening in Bangladesh, and especially in the R&D industry, there are a lot of initiatives are coming up. But also I'd like to address the questions I received regarding this legislation from EU legislation for the human rights. That is the project I was talking about in my initial space, that we are working with this. It's called Responsible Business Hub. That is initiated by with the support of GIZ, and we are doing this project. And as I said, that we are making this training program. We already started a training program for 50 factories right now is on the training, and we'll be training more and more factories to understand how we can make the transition of this compliance-based operation then to the risk-based operation. So that is where we are heading to. I think when people will learn and understand how the things are going on, probably that will help everybody to promote themselves to the next level, because we have a practice for many years. We have a kind of a system in place, so it will take a bit time to understand the system and to convert ourselves to the next level. But what I can tell you that is that from as an entrepreneur, as a from our association, that we are wholehearted to see the change. It is not that we are only looking forward to earn money, but also we are looking forward how we can make changes, and we are looking for the collaboration. We are looking for we are always open ourselves to participate any kinds of initiative which is very convenient for our industry, and also for the because it is very important that if we don't do this, then we'll left behind and we will not be competitive anymore. That we know very well. So we will be doing that one, and we are open for any kinds of collaboration. So that's from me. I think I hope I have answered the questions. I don't know if it's anonymous attendees. I don't know the name. So it is that's my answer for him. Norha.
Thanks so much, Mustafiz. And I will come with a follow-up question on this as well. But first, I would like to go to Jennifer and get your perspective on what are those opportunities. You spoke about the need for an enabling environment, but where do we start? What opportunities do you see?
So, following up on what BJME said, I think the first opportunity is that the industry is ready to receive. So that's a great opportunity. Now comes the work, which is the responsibility of stakeholders to support the industry. So I think the opportunity and showing the business case also to the industry is important for us. EU due diligence, I think, I mean, the due diligence legislations actually set a tone. How do they set the tone? Because you're talking about policies and not policies. You start with basically risk assessment, but risk assessment is part of a prevention mechanism where you start with the organization policies and then you go on to risk assessing. In the risk assessment itself, you will be looking at the gender aspects. You can look at the gender aspects at the different levels at which people are there, any disparity, like as people are, so just having a gender policy is not there. Are you an equal opportunities employer? So are ads going out like that? Or are you in the risk assessment that do we bring in the maternity issue? So the policy and the risk assessment will work towards the preventive side. And then if something happens, obviously people want conducive environment. For a conducive environment, as you talk about preventive mechanisms and you risk mitigate, etc., if an event happens, how is it handled? Are people feeling that they can report without repercussions? And if report, is it being addressed? A huge part of the grievance mechanism is also important. But it makes good business sense in what we do. The opportunity right now is to, I know industries are also driven by the issues of, say, profit. What is the ROI? What is the return on investment? If we look at addressing the issues of gender and doing the risk assessments, following due diligence, what would happen? What would happen are a number of things. First of all, you can see the return on investment. Does productivity increase as a result, or does it decrease? We always think that conducive environment, if I now try to give X, Y, Z, I'm going to hinder productivity. But it's part and parcel of productivity. Look at Vietnam. Look at countries like Philippines, Vietnam, where you see in the mid-managerial positions, you have women. A large portion actually is women. Because if you have a period pain, can I say it to a male supervisor? Or would I be more relaxed to say it to a female supervisor? Some women have period cramps, which they really struggle with. Can I say that and then take my leave? The productivity gets hampered when they say this, they don't get the leave, and then they absent themselves. So how ensuring policies and procedures and doing the risk assessment? That's why we say a certain percentage of women in mid-managerial positions can actually improve productivity. Now the aspect would come that, yes, easier said than done. How do we ensure they come? So the conduciveness is get a certain mass, work with them. Skilling is definitely required. Soft skills is required. Hard skills are required. But if you are going to have, say, and the gender equality, you need both to progress in society. So rather than looking at as hindrance, seeing that how can this support in my productivity, that would be key. And I think the due diligence legislations now set the tone for this. It's a huge opportunity through the due diligence, through a management process, how we can holistically look at things and address. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Jennifer.
Can I just add one point?
Yes, please.
I really heard what Mustafiz bhai said about the promotion, but I just wanted to put my point that, I'll say that education level, even within the female workers, has been increased a lot. The things are not in that level like what it was in 20 years ago. In a practical experience, like in our organization 20 years ago to like 10 years ago, we had a program called Adult Literacy for RNG workers who couldn't read and write. And I think 8 years ago, precisely, we had to stop that program because precisely we had been seeing the student in that class are really decreasing because level of education in the workers, those are joining in the RNG as an RNG worker, that is like, class 10 or like above, or like, who done their secondary certificate. So now we converted that program as a life skill program, like we are giving computer education. So that tells that the education level within the garment workers has been increased. It is not in 20 years ago. I think you just need to enable that position or create that environment that women workers, they come up front and says that, yeah, we want to accept this promotion, or we wanted to get training on that. Why they are not doing that? One of the main reasons they're not being encouraged. Second is supervisor need to stay in the factory 1 to 2 more hours when worker leaves, and that 2 more hours is not paid. And if you have like a very small number of female supervisor going to home in that night without any transport facility, it's not safe. So these are the, I think, not conducive environment that we need to create, that change we need to bring.
Thanks for your additional comments there. And Jennifer, thanks. I think those were really interesting points in terms of looking at what are the different pieces that can together create that conducive environment that all of us are talking about. And if I can go deeper in that and ask you about what can be done in collaboration with different stakeholders in the industry, definitely as a civil society organization, as a workers organization, as an industry association, but also looking at brands. And I think some of the brand representatives are in the participants as well. So what can be done collaboratively to address some of these issues? And when I look at the Q&A, there are specific questions around gender-based violence, around grievance mechanism. So if you can also try and weave that in your response and give us some ideas of where do you see those collaboration opportunities? How can all of the stakeholders, or at least some of the stakeholders, come together and try to address the challenges that we have been discussing? And maybe Jennifer, if I can start with you this time, and
Sure.
then maybe go the other way around.
Okay, great. Yes, so a couple of things. Obviously, it is not one person's deal. This is a collaboration of everyone. So if I talk about the brands, I mean, brands can actually want a certain percent, in the sense that they can motivate people with certain percentages. Say, as you go mid-level supervisory posts, women can occupy those spaces. People are resistant to change, yet the only constant is change. Now, as if I bring up what Kalpana had said, that the worker of 20 years back and the worker of today is different. There are generation gaps. You have millennials, Gen Zs, everybody coming in now. Perspectives, understanding is different. So keeping that in context and in mind, I mean, brands can support factories whereby the change would be happening where supervisory roles are occupied by women. Do the risk assessment on what are the risks, involve the workers on what are the factors for which they're not moving up. Find that out, and then create the conducive. Best learnings from factories are there. There are demonstrated examples where there are many women on supervisories, but it's only a handful of factories. Why not learn from some of the best learnings? Brands have a role to play whereby they allow this conducive environment to come. It's not just, and very important for brands, that if there is a sexual harassment, say somebody has reported sexual harassment or bullying or things like that, gender-based violence, women are being bullied because of their socio-economic and various other issues, then it's something that nobody should shy away from. A factory, to say a factory, you must report and address, and then people checking on the reporting and addressing. The brands also have to work with factories who are reporting and addressing. If you're reporting and addressing, it's no longer under the carpet. And you can, I mean, the factories can feel that, yes, things are being addressed. The brand should be rest assured that, yes, problems are coming and the problems are being addressed. If the problems are not addressed and under the carpet, that is where the numbers you're getting now, 80%, 60%, say harassment is happening, going unchecked. So let's make it an open platform of learning and collaboration. CSOs have been working on this area for many years. They can support, brands can support in ensuring that, yes, report. If you report and you're addressing, it's fine, rather than shying away from seeing the problem at all. Their involvement is crucial to bring this all to work together. And of course, the manufacturers have the responsibility because they will have to set in the systems. And as they set in the systems, brands should not shy away. And there are various stakeholders who can all work together to support. The countries like, so I think that is one way to address grievances. The other part, which I've been in this industry for a long time, addressing the grievances. How are the grievances actually being addressed? Are proper inquiries, we call them inquiries or investigations, how are they happening? How is the media? Everybody has their own mechanism of sorting problems out, otherwise this industry would not thrive today. But how are those mechanisms actually playing out? Are they playing rightly out? Those things we can support the factories so that they own their internal mechanism. There are over 3 million cases in Bangladesh which are at backlog. So it's not that we should be sending everything to legal representation or courts. But if the internal grievance mechanism is robust and people have a confidence in reporting and in the addressal, and everybody is at part that, yes, reports will come, they'll be addressed. Reporting numbers higher basically means that issues are being addressed properly. That perception, if it comes in, we can actually do wonders for the sector if we all collaborate. And if one of us shy off, then there's a break in the chain. That's what I thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks, Jennifer. So I think looking at credibility of some of these mechanisms, making sure that there are pilots that we can learn from and then take it at scale, and making sure that everybody does their role responsibly, and which is also something that we found in the benchmark, where I think brands are making those commitments, but when it comes to working with suppliers, there were big gaps that we found. Mustafiz, if I can come to you with that question, what collaboration opportunities do you see? How can we start working with different stakeholders in addressing some of these challenges?
I think since there are a lot of things are happening, it's already a lot of things on our plate. So we are doing a lot of things. But I would like to say in brief that if a factory has a gender sensitive policies, for example, the internal policies, if they have the right mechanism, right grievance mechanism, everything is in place, there is no actually room for any kinds of gender-based violence. The problem starts actually when we are too reluctant, and also sometimes there is no monitoring mechanism from the brands, you see, end of the day, only the brand, the manufacturer, and the workers, we are talking only about these things, but there are also no monitoring system, even from the law enforcing agencies, because also from the government agencies, they are not also involved in this process. Only when it is go to the court or something like this, so they only lawful action, then they are involving. So I think if we can make a platform, for example, platform to make a dialogue that where the women's voice can be heard. What is the problem? If we can know more and more deeper, way regarding the gender-based violence, then probably we can know more, and we can start mitigating more. For example, if I talk about my factory, my factory become the part of the ILO Better Work program recently. I mean, it's just 1 year back we have started, and many of the issues I never heard that is coming up from my factory, which is based on the compliance mechanism. I never heard of that kind of gender-based violence, which is when I started working with the Better Work program. Then it comes to me. Then I understood that there are a lot of things happening in my factory, which is never been heard. So that is the thing. If we have the right collaboration, if we know what's going on in the place, but I think we are not a bad people, that we are. It is not like that. So what is happening is that I must say that when we are sitting like this, when we are talking in an international level or something like this, then we are always arguing each other, we are confronting each other with the things. But if we collaborate each other, if we know our own problem, then it can be solved. Actually, it's not an issue. We have done a lot of things. We are doing a lot of programs every day. There are many issues coming up, and we are solving daily basis. So if we can make a right system in place, I don't think it should be a problem. But of course, the brand has a shared responsibility. They must feel that this is an issue, and they need to address. If they think that they will shop around because they will find something cheaper in the other factory, I think that will not solve the problem. If they wanted to have any specific qualityful, a really human rights due diligence mechanism, a factory who are actually maintaining all the things, and if they wanted to pay a little bit higher, they should do that. But I mean, what is happening? They are not doing this thing. They're just shopping around. I mean, who are cheaper, they are going there. So I think the fair price is of course an issue. Which can also I think mitigate a lot of things, lot of problems, because when you involve, I mean, when you onboard with any initiative, there are always a lot of costs are involved. For example, I'm not telling that training are a cost involvement, but it is true that always we have to provide the training during the working hours. So how many hours actually we have to train them with different kind of initiatives? So we have a limited also in the time also, that how much actually we can spend for the training of the workers. So we need to find the as Jennifer was saying, the return of investment is very important. That if we have to spend everything on all our time on the training and the educating on all the things, when we will do the production? So we need to find a way, a fine line where we can make the production and also make sure that the gender equality is there and the human rights due diligence mechanisms are working. So we need to find a fine line, and we are learning it. And I think we are in the transition time, and I think we will be, as I said in my first speech, that I'm sure that we'll be the champion of this, because we know this how to handle this, all the challenges. Thank you.
Absolutely. And I think, confrontation is obviously not going to solve these issues. Collaboration will. And Kalpana, you've heard both the speakers talking about different areas of collaboration. So what, in your view, can be added to that to make sure that we all kind of get a broader consensus on what are those issues on which different stakeholders can collaborate?
Yeah, thank you. Let's start with what Mustafiz Bhai was saying about the brands. Yeah, it is this industry in Bangladesh, like for I think more than 40 years now. So it's over 3 decades. So many things that I don't want it to say that we need to start. We're supposed to start long before. But I just wanted to talk about the brands that, brands should not just bring some more, new issues or more issues with their COC, like code of conduct, and say that we wanted to see that factories are compliant or do the compliance with all these without making any value added with the merchandise they're sourcing from our country. I think we have enough tolerance on that. So at the same time, I would say that we're the second largest apparel producer in the world. Our factory owners also should, get some attitude now that why don't you make your floor wage and say that you're not going to go down to this and make these brands to buy product with that. I think that we need to, if we haven't learned that yet, we should learn, okay? It is time. It is time. Okay, let not these brands, just go here and there and make a chaos with the price that, oh, if you can pay less, I'm going to come to you. Don't let them do that anymore. Just get your attitude. If you can have that attitude, we'll be with you, but with condition, of course. So we from our organization, like we are helping 15 factories with their anti-harassment committee or complaint committee in their factories, and they're really running great because they have that complaint mechanism. They have that resilience in their factory setup that they're really not doing that because the brands wanted to see that, or they need to compete with something. They're doing that to enabling a women-friendly workplace. So they're letting the women educating on that these are the gender-based violence are. If you face any of those, please bring these into the complaint committee. And they do have a real grievance system. So I think, we have done enough project that we are aligned with in this project, or we are doing this program. I think our industry needs to believe that it is a time for them to create a women-friendly work environment, and that is why they are allowing this. And if we can achieve these ILOC 190 identified by our country, and we have the legal reform on that, that would be an amazing benchmark for us to show the world that we really achieved great for our women workers, and that law is enforced in this factory. So as a worker, trade unionist or worker rights perspectives, the collaboration that we wanted to say. We really wanted to see enabling a worker representation in the factory. If we don't have a discussion table in the factory, we are missing so many things. The workers should have right to organize and right to bargain. The right to organize and union registration, not in a number, with a healthy union practice in the factory. Trust me, if we have that, if we would have that union representation in the factory, we would be not losing these 4 workers who died in a minimum wage protest. Because workers can discuss in their in-house, they will have a discussion table up there. They don't need to go to the street and shout that we really need that wages. So the worker representation and that collaboration is missing in many cases from the industry. I think that need to enable, and that really, resilience need to come to the factory owners, that less, workers to exercise their union rights freely.
Thanks. And I'm also conscious of time. I know we have been able to answer a few of those questions that came from the participants. So maybe I'll just take a couple of questions. There are, I think, quite a few questions. Unfortunately, we may not be able to answer all of them. I've also seen my colleagues have responded to some of those questions already. So I'll take a sorry, I'll take a couple of those questions, and then while responding to these questions, if you can also give your closing statement by thinking of the next 10 years, perhaps, or by 2030, when the Sustainable Development Goals are also going to come to an end. What do you foresee for the sector, for the Bangladesh garments, factories, and workers from your own perspective? What would you like to see changing? What would the sector look like in the next 7 years or so? So let me read out a couple of questions, and then you can try and respond to those questions in your closing statements as well. And one of the questions is from Sandhya Drew, and this one is for you, Kalpana, which is about wages. She says that there is the issue of adequacy of minimum wages. And also, do you have a view on the most effective approach to address work under the applicable minimum wage, whatever its level is? And do you have any examples of success of that approach? Then also looking at a question for BGME, I think for you, Mustafiz, which is looking at, and perhaps this can be answered by anyone, and this is a question from Vidhi, which is on the grievance mechanisms. And she asks whether the grievance mechanisms are good enough to handle serious offenses such as sexual violence, or should these be referred to the state-based mechanisms when and as they are identified? And then maybe a last question from Veronique, which is about getting a large number of factories accepting bringing on the public place their sexual harassment cases to make the problem public instead of taboo, for the buying community to understand the problem is there, and it might help factories to keep the topic out of the carpet. Considering the time, I can't take any more questions, but perhaps these are the questions if you can use in your closing statement. And maybe Mustafiz, this time we can start with you. So where do you see the sector from a gender and a human rights lens by 2030? And perhaps you can also address some of the questions that were asked. You're on mute, Mustafiz.
I think probably from BGME, I don't know, you have seen something like this. I don't know, you can see this one. We have a, it's called, we have a strategic vision by 2030. So we set up a strategic vision with 20 specific goals aligned with SDGs. So we are actually working on it with the environmental sustainability, with the social sustainability, and also the governance. So the ESG, we set up a clear ESG vision, and we are actually working on it, where also the gender equality and also the other human rights issues are also addressed at the same time. because as per SDG number 5 and 10, we need to find. We are also working on the SDG number 5 and 10 at the same time. So this is how actually we are also working in BGMEA to make ourselves, a sourcing hub where people will buy from Bangladesh proudly. So that is our motto. That is our intention. So, but it will not happen overnight. I think the inflation will create another problem. The COVID will make another issue. The war will make another issue. So we'll be actually having a lot of troubles in the same time. But we have to adopt and we need to understand this. First of all, I wanted to say that the workers, the people who are working in our factory, they are our people. They are my people. So why I will make a system that where my people will be, discriminated and they will not be respected. So that kind of things will not think of that, because the dynamics have changed. We can see the paradigm shift of changing behavior of and as Kalpana was saying, the attitude is also changing. If I talk about before that, we actually did not learn how to say no to a order, and any order we did not learn it. Now we are learning it, that how when we should say that I cannot do this order. I cannot. Instead of not paying the workers, better we make a degrowth. We will reduce our capacity, make a factory in a better way, so that we can run and we can pay them on time, and everything running on time. So why we are investing every time with too many floors and a lot of swing machines and all the things? So we need to find a good system in our investment procedure, in our in our production, in our marketing, everywhere we need to think about. It is not only that we will only look after the human rights issue, but we also need to understand how much order we have to take. Because if we take too much order, the human rights violation will be there, because I have to run the factory for more hours. So then I will be blaming for the more working hours. The working hours problem will be there because I have taken too much order. So we need to learn in many ways. It is not only the human rights violation, but also we need to learn where and how we should maintain our marketing, our financial plan, all the things we need to understand. And I think that the paradigm shifts are coming up. It is not anymore, invisible. It is coming. I think by next 2-3 years, you will see a lot of things, because with the new wages, I think a lot of factories may not be able to operate with the new wages. So who can operate the factory? They must learn how to operate their factory with this minimum wages. So we are in a shift, and I think we will see a lot of changes in the coming days.
Thanks so much, Mustafid. Really, we are running out of time. We are already over time. So Kalpana, I'll come to you, and maybe if you can respond to that question, and also your closing statement in 2 minutes, and then I'll come to Jennifer.
Yeah, I'll just take 1 minute. There is no effective example on the minimum wage. Yeah, the minimum wage that has been announced falls short for workers. That is why workers are not accepting, or we trade union have a different view on that. But yet, from the brands or some of the CSOs or MSIs working together, I know, but we haven't seen that any effective application of that. So I think the solution that I see on these regarding this, that is like future living wage for workers, and that would be not the responsibility of the manufacturers only. It should be coming from the brands, adding money with every single merchandise they sourcing from our country. So that would be my point on that answer. And my closing statement, I'm an optimistic person, so I definitely wanted to see that this industry improves and at least another 100 years in our country. But from 10 years from now, what I wanted to see that the job that our workers have, they have with dignity. I believe that we don't have a dignified job now because we don't have living wage. The union voice is not there. There is a gender-based violence free. So all these issues will be resolved, and we can collaboratively doing that. So 10 years from now, I want to see that our workers have a job with dignity. Thank you.
Great. Thanks a lot for that, Kalpana. Last word to you, Jennifer. Last 2 minutes.
Okay, so very quickly, we need to adapt to some new realities. So yes, I think in the 80s was the 90s was the child labor issue, and then the fire issues, and then the infrastructure issues. I think this decade is focused on rights at work and environmental sustainability. So what do we expect to see within the 2030? We expect to see conducive work environments. We expect to see women at all levels, at the different levels. And it's not easy. Behavior change takes time. So people have also changed. And since we're talking about behavior change, perception change, it will take time, but the journey can start. I'm very happy that Mustafiz is talking about all-encompassing, say that these things are there. And we realize things take time, but we need to start the process, and all stakeholders have a part to play, and it can't be one-sided. It has to be all-sided. Brands also have to accommodate, manufacturers have to accommodate. But one thing I think we want to change the lens by 2030, that conducive work environment is not a hindrance to productivity. Bringing in women at different levels is not a hindrance to productivity. Good behavior is not a hindrance to productivity. That is what we aspire to see as to how actually the changes can happen for the better good. And I think that should be a vision and a roadmap. And how can every party play to support that? We have been supporting factories with investigations and with, say, how committees take decisions, because we've done it in BRAC also. In BRAC, we deal with 15, 20 cases a month. So understanding that, how you carry out fact findings and all of that, this needs to be more sort of, this needs to be improved in factories, because a lot of issues come up because these things are not managed quite well. So that part, I think, also by 2030, if risk assessment is there and if proper investigations, mediations, and feedbacks happen, we should be progressing to see a conducive work environment in the future, and actually showing the demonstrative effect of how it can support productivity rather than it's something separate from productivity. And some of those gains, we can look elsewhere also, where things are happening, and take best practices. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thanks all of you for your sharing your perspective and also being candid. Yes, the road is long, but I think what we heard today is that through collaboration, through looking at some of the initiatives and doing our own work within our stakeholder groups, we can definitely bring about that change and impact. So once again, thanks to all the three panelists for a wonderful conversation. And now I will hand over to Harpreet for the second panel discussion. So once again, thanks, and Harpreet, over to you.
Thanks, Namit, Kalpana, Mustafid, and Jennifer, I think, for a really, really interesting conversation. I was hoping this conversation continues and we don't have to come in, but really to kind of, just hearing the conversation just now, and if I were to say the two takeaways that I have, and I think that fits very nicely to the next panel today, what I really see as a takeaway from this interesting conversation is that it is important to have policies and guidelines and structures and processes in place, but what we really need is an enabling environment. I think both Kalpana, Jennifer, but also Mustafa has mentioned a number of times that what we need to see is the change in the work culture, but also how do we address the social norms, gender norms, to address systemic issues and the underlying root causes. And it was encouraging also to kind of move away with a very, very I think positive note. What Mustafa's Bhai said is we don't have to confront, but we have to collaborate and we have to move together in this. And I think that really fits nicely into the next segment of the webinar today, which is focusing on bridging the global to local gap in supply chain. And if I could ask my colleagues to bring in the speakers and add a pin to their videos as well. In fact, just hearing this conversation, and if you're looking at sort of all the global developments, and I see as one of the key critique of these global developments have been its North-centric focus, limited understanding and engagement from the global South. In fact, I've just come back, from Dhaka, and we've heard from different stakeholders, and particularly from the global south. And often suppliers and stakeholders have raised issues around limited capacities, limited resources, but also for brands. And I think that's something that Kalpana, I'm glad, Kalpana, you mentioned about the purchasing practices. But I think one of the other key issues that we're hearing a lot more is encouraging the exchange of technology and innovative solutions with the suppliers, when the brands are committing to, for example, net zero targets and so on. So where we see is that transitioning from this global, transitioning from this global discussion to a localized one really allows for a deeper exploration of the specific challenges and opportunities. We heard some challenges, some opportunities just now. But really understanding how these broader global trends and issues impact the lives, but also sort of encouraging the stakeholders at a local level and bringing really this conversation from a global perspective down to local level, which often involves narrowing down the focus, considering how global issues or developments or concepts really relate to the specific localized solutions and situations as well. So how do you strike a balance between aligning with these global objectives, but also sort of tailoring solutions that meet the unique needs and its capacities and resources at the local level? I think that's what we're going to focus the next couple of minutes today at this session. I know we are running 12 minutes behind, so there is a lot of pressure on me already to make sure that my panelists stick to the timeline, and we'll still try to finish at the assigned time that we agreed on. And really, it's a both a pleasure and honor to be moderating this discussion with this eminent set of panelists today. We have with us Carla Dombeth, who's the advisor at Initiative for Global Solidarity at GIZ. We have with us Mans Carlson, who's also the head of ESG at Ausbil Investment Management. We have with us Saiful Milat, who's the network representative for Bangladesh, Amfori. Last but not the least, we also have with us Professor Surya Deva, who's the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Development and also a professor at Macquarie Law School. So thank you everyone for joining today. Given that we've had the first half of the day really sort of helping us set the context, so I will not take any more time. But Milat, if I could really just start this conversation with you, because we understand that Amfori works with several suppliers in the region. And you've been engaging with suppliers not just in Bangladesh, but you've really been engaging. Amfori as an organization engages its suppliers across the region as well. So if you could really share some of the challenges that suppliers particularly face in translating these global corporate policies and processes to local contexts, and if you could really bring in examples from Bangladesh, but also other examples. What do you see are some of the key lessons that are learned and challenges that remain? And if I may, already before handing it over to all my speakers, if I could just say, I think the information about your organizations have already been shared with the participants here. So if you could really focus on the thematic issue under discussion, and perhaps provide links to, if you do want to share more information about your work in the chat or in the Q&A, that would be very, very helpful. You have 5 minutes to respond. Thanks, Milat. Over to you.
Thank you, Harpreet. And good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you're joining from. Thank you to everybody. Good to see you again, Harpreet, and Professor Surya Deva, Carla as well. Mans, first time to see you. I will try to cut short because we are running a little behind and not give you guys our company's update. Harpreet, thanks for clarifying that. I will go straight into the question. Bangladesh, being the second largest RMG exporter of the world, and also, as you know, one of our most bestseller service is BSCI. The Amfori BSCI is being the second largest in the world after China. So it is strategically and a very important country, Bangladesh. In the business world of buyer-producer relation, I believe it is mostly a top-down approach till date. The global corporate policies and procedures are disseminated to its suppliers, and it comes like this, that they got to accept it. Unfortunately, this is still a practice in this business world. this has been going the same way for all the time. The first challenge, I see, is transparency, which I believe is a fundamental factor in any relationship, be it personal, be it corporate, be it business buyers and producers, suppliers and service providers, be it product or service, whatever. I think the first challenge is transparency. This should prevail among all partners of business, and let's be clear that this should work both ways, which is a challenge, as you can imagine. When I say both way, means if the relationship should be between a buyer and a producer, it should not be only that the buyer wants, the retailer wants the producer to be transparent and share all the information, but the other way around as well. The buyer should also give them the real picture of their business position today. The second challenge, I would say, is the lack of understanding or rather, I would say, the interpretation of the corporate policies and procedures and how the suppliers perceive them. So that was the first part of my question to you, Harpreet. Answer to your question, Harpreet. The lessons learned so far, I would say, the mindset of working in complete openness will not only strengthen the trust required for long-term relationship, but also ease all small tensions throughout the process of operation and business towards mutually agreeable solutions before they become larger in size. And I don't say beyond control, but I would be a little careful about the word here, because we are seeing what's happening around the region in Bangladesh especially, and more challenging to address at a later stage, I would say. So these are the main challenges I would like to highlight. Harpreet, over to you, if I answered you.
Sure. No, thank you, Milad. In fact, you did highlight a very, very important, aspect of any relationship, be it our professional or personal. I think transparency and honesty and sincerity is what we really strive as humans in all the relationships that we have. So, really to kind of have a mindset where, you understand each other's requirements, but also be really open and transparent about it. And I'm going to pick up what you said, the first, I think the core that you said, often the approach or the way that it works is accept as it comes. And, that's what you're saying is, these global tools, global, the other tools and the guidance is pretty much developed at that level. But really, with the only option is that you accept and you don't really have limited opportunities to engage and co-develop the process. And with that, Carla, actually I want to come to you because you're trying to do something differently in this space, right? I mean, we look at the work of GIZ. We were in this meeting just the day before, and where you mentioned some of the ways that you're trying to make sure that we're looking at the Act on Corporate Due Diligence Obligations in Supply Chains, the German Act that came into force in 2023. But since then, GIZ has really been supporting different initiatives to promote the implementation, but I think more importantly, to bring the conversations to the local level and capacitate your local partners and stakeholders at that level, right? So you're trying to maybe move away from that approach of, it's not just accept as it comes, but, try and understand and engage with the process. So if you could perhaps, share some of the initiatives, some of the challenges that you face, but maybe just, I know it's a mammoth task, but if you could maybe take the first 2 or 3 minutes, just very briefly, to provide an overview of the Act so that our participants, our audience understands in what context are we speaking about. And this is, before I hand it over to, just also a reminder to the participants, if you do have questions, please add it in the Q&A. We will take it after the first round of the questions as well to the panelists. So Carla, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Harpreet. And thanks for having me on this panel and this very interesting event. Yeah, it's a good question, and I'll try my best to summarize about the Due Diligence Act. So I thought I will start by giving a little bit of information why, especially in Germany, we have this law. So this is not, let's say, coming out from nowhere, but this is based on the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights that were endorsed in 2011, as you know. And one of the recommendations of that was that countries also will have national action plans on business and human rights. So Germany adopted a national action plan from 2016 to 2020. And in that national action plan, they actually set a target that 50% of the German companies, which have at least 500 employees, should voluntarily implement human rights due diligence. And then there were 2 rounds of monitoring to assess this. And they found that actually this target was not met, and less than 20% of the German companies really voluntarily implemented human rights due diligence. So of course, this created a lot of debate. And as a result of that, the German parliament decided to have this law, which was passed in 2021. And as you said, came into force in 2023. So that's where it comes from. And now the scope of the law includes companies based in Germany, which have more than 1,000 employees in Germany. And the substantial prohibitions or risks which are covered in the Act when it comes to human rights and the environment are all based on internationally agreed conventions. So there are also no, in this sense, new standards, but it's rather the implementation of existing conventions. And of course, what's the approach of it is, as already was said before, a risk-based approach. So businesses have to look into their supply chain risks and then prevent, mitigate, or end any risk or violations that they find. And they also have to establish grievance mechanisms in their supply chain. So another, I think, important aspect to understand about this is how this law is actually enforced. And for this, of course, there's a supervisory authority in Germany. And the companies under the scope of the law have to report yearly to this authority. And based on that, they assess the companies, and they can also request further information or even investigate the premises of those companies if necessary. And in case of administrative offenses, for example, if companies don't submit their reports, the supervising authority can also impose fines. And finally, there's also an online-based system where rights holders from anywhere in the world, which may be violated in their rights by supply chains of these German companies, can submit their grievances, and then it will be looked into that. So that's a very brief summary. And of course, the question is from global to local. So what does it mean for the suppliers in Bangladesh or in other countries? And I think it's still very early to really give a definite answer to that, because we're in the first year of implementation. So I think the next years will show how it all unfolds. But what I would like to highlight is that the responsibility for due diligence under this act remains, of course, with the companies which are under the scope of the law, and it cannot be just pushed down in the supply chain. Having said that, of course, it will be necessary for companies to cooperate with suppliers. And for that, that's where our work comes in. We think it's good if the suppliers are prepared and if they also know what does it mean, to do due diligence. So this is where our project comes in at GIZ, the German Development Corporation. We try to create awareness for HID in producer countries such as Bangladesh, but also other countries. And I'm happy that you had Mustafis on the panel before. He already mentioned that we are working together to establish responsible business hubs. So this is happening with BGMEA and also with BKMEA, the other big producer organization here in Bangladesh. And those business hubs have been officially inaugurated in June, and they are now taking up activities to raise awareness among their member factories, provide them information, guidance, and roll out trainings. So yeah, they're also part of a network of business hubs from the different countries, so that in the future we hope to see learning and experience sharing also between the different countries. Thanks.
Sure. Thanks, Carla, for this brief overview of the Due Diligence Act. But I think just also sort of sharing some of the, some of the work that you've been doing and the engagements and the collaborations that you have with BGME and BKMA. If I could actually just take this question, which I think is in the Q&A, which pretty much, in some ways relate to what you just mentioned, is the question goes as, the demands, legislations, and requirements are all same pretty much, for suppliers worldwide. Whereas the progress in Bangladesh seems to be slower as compared to other countries. And I understand that you have responsible business hubs also in other countries, and understanding that it's really, really a new initiative. And I think in some countries just been rolled out a couple of months ago. Do you think, if you are able to respond to, why do you think this specifically is a challenge here in Bangladesh, or why do you find those differences? I think as one of the participants highlighted here, saying Bangladesh, the progress seems to be much slower than others. So if you have any quick follow-up responses to that.
Yeah, of course, it's important to understand this legislation is worldwide. It's not specific to Bangladesh, and it's also not sector specific. And that's why I wouldn't necessarily say that Bangladesh has more challenge than other countries, or even has a slower progress than other countries. I wouldn't necessarily say that. Also, if we look at other sectors like, I don't know, I don't want to do finger pointing, but maybe electronics or other sectors, where we often see that the textile sector is actually a bit ahead when it comes to social environmental standards. So I wouldn't necessarily say that. Yeah.
Sure. Thanks, Carla, for this additional reflection as well. In fact, in some ways, we really see that, the Bangladesh, particularly the apparel sector, has taken on some initiatives, which kind of also sets them apart. But at least, I think just hearing Mustafa in terms of, that they understand the issues are and are looking for collaborative approaches and are looking for solutions, I think is indeed encouraging as well. Mans, I know that, remember, we understand that you were here in Bangladesh, I think a couple of months ago, sort of, earlier in Bangladesh, where you've had lots of meetings with stakeholders, with suppliers. And, I think it'd be good to sort of hear an investor's perspective. And if you have any reflections on, the question that was just raised, but really, what do you think is the role of investors, particularly in contexts like Bangladesh, in promoting and implementing the global advancements on business and human rights nationally? What do you think, and how do you think the investors can really bring in checks and balances on human rights and gender considerations when investments are made? I think particularly in countries with weak governance structures and processes. And I'm not saying Bangladesh, as a point and example, but I'm just saying, more broadly in terms of, specifically the countries where you do see these weak governance structures and processes. So how do you think, what's the role where that investors can come in and play, to kind of create that level playing field as well? Thanks, Mans, over to you.
Thank you, and good evening from Sydney, Australia. So, yeah, I definitely think investors can play a key role. And as someone who's been involved in the responsible investment industry for more than 15 years, I think there is an increased interest in the social factors, or S issues, among investors in general. And I think, notwithstanding the UN guiding principles on business human rights, which obviously apply universally, I think investors, generally speaking, have a fairly strong vested interest in understanding and be on top of human rights issues in the companies they invest in, because ultimately all investors are different, but the relevance of human rights issues, I think, needs to be tied back to your individual investment philosophy. So at Ausbil, where I work, we have an investment philosophy that focuses on three things. So first, earnings revisions drive share prices. And then second, earnings sustainability is a key factor for companies we look at. And also we prefer companies with quality management. So I'd imagine many other investors have a similar philosophy too. So let's tie it back to human rights then. So rather than making motherhood statements or talking about these things from a perspective of obligations versus various frameworks, and we also have a number of transparency acts that apply to us as investors, I'd like to take it straight back to the investment philosophy and unpack that. So if I look at earnings revisions, as I mentioned before, as the first element, well, brands are key assets, right? And brand damage can be costly and time-consuming to restore for companies we invest in. And they can also lead to loss of sales. And you only need to look at what happened to the UK retailer Boohoo a few years ago, where there were allegations about labour rights issues in their supply chain, and the share price took a big hit because of that. But ultimately, I think it comes down to earnings sustainability. So if you have a business model where you rely on, or the current earnings rely on abused workers, underpaid workers, or even illegal activities like modern slavery and supply chains, those earnings will not be sustainable. And not in a world where there's increased regulation, including transparency acts like the one we have in Australia, the legislation in Germany that Carla just mentioned, and of course, like outright import bans, like the Custom Border Protection Act in the US. And to mention an example there, I think Top Glove, the Malaysian glove manufacturer that was banned from exporting to the US on allegations of forced labor a few years ago. I think that's a prime example of an earnings impact and earnings sustainability. I mean, the import ban has been lifted now, but it was just one out of many companies that were subject to an import ban in the US. So those are good examples to remember. And I think historically, in my industry, investors are mainly focused on the E, or climate change in particular, of the ESG, but the S factors become more important. And perhaps it is because we now have a few real world examples of where things can go really, really wrong from an investor perspective. But it's not just about earnings either, because I think it's also the way I mentioned before, the quality of management. And that's a bit of a, how to put it, like non-financial or qualitative nature of an assessment we make in companies we invest in. And I think it's important because the market clearly prices in those things as well. And I think most investors will agree that all things equal, let's say you have two companies, they're both identical, but one has a stronger ESG profile than the other, including human rights, risk management. Well, most investors would probably choose the one with a strong ESG risk management framework because it's less risky. And I would even say many investors would be happy to pay a premium for that too. So that's how we approach ESG, and including human rights too, as a proxy for management quality when we assess companies. So what I'm saying is, let's say I've been to Bangladesh, like you mentioned. I visited factories there. I met with workers, unions, etc. Then if I come back to Australia and meet companies here, and I realize that they don't know anything about these issues in their own supply chain. Even worse, they might not even know where they're sourcing from. As an investor, you've got to ask yourself the question, what else should I worry about them? So it doesn't always have to be about numbers. It can also be quite qualitative. So with that, investors at least should care about human rights, but how should we care? So as an investor, you have a number of different options. You can divest from companies. You can file shareholder resolutions. You can engage with companies. And personally, I've always had a strong preference for engagement for a number of reasons. So first, I think we can encourage companies to improve their practices, and I'll come back to that point later on, perhaps in the interest of time. But there's a lot of practical ideas. We're trying to find win-win situations for workers, companies, and investors. And the other thing is, just divesting a company doesn't necessarily lead to any improvements, because if I hold company shares and I'm engaging with a company, and then I just sell those shares, effectively giving it to someone else who's not engaging with that company, well, then there's going to be even less action. And it does remind me of my first trip to Bangladesh in 2014, which was 1 year after the Rana Plaza tragedy, of course. And I spoke to a number of workers, and they all said the same thing. They did not want brand companies to pull out of Bangladesh. They wanted them to stay. They just want to have decent working conditions. So I'm thinking in a similar way, if you're an investor, if you just head for the exit and sell the shares, you might actually not achieve any change. And then the other thing, of course, is and I think that's come up a few times today. These issues are very systemic. Right, so every company we could potentially invest in would have some human rights issues in their supply chain. So if you have zero tolerance on that, well, where do you draw the line? Then I think it's better to invest in companies and try to help them to encourage them to improve. And when we do that, it's all about just applying what is global best practice on human rights risk management, on labor rights, etc., etc. So again, without being ethical about this, I think investors should care about human rights issues because they're financially relevant. And I think that the key role we can play is really in engagement, not just with companies, but also with policy makers. So maybe I didn't answer all the points in your questions there, but I'm happy to continue the conversation because there's a lot of things to unpack there. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Mans. In fact, you did bring in a couple of points, and I was just trying to make notes and see, what to pick. But I think some of the key issues that you raised, particularly the first one is really around the brand damage. And, you talk about sort of the reputational risk, but also how these reputational risks could lead to operational and legislation, and the legislative risk. And then often these risks collide, and eventually, it's a loss-loss situation for everyone, and that doesn't help either. And I think there's a question in the Q&A right now, which sort of talks about also, particularly in the context of, we're looking at the reputational risk, particularly in the context of export-oriented companies, but what's happening at the local level in the smaller companies is, if they don't care really about reputation, how do we engage? I will come back to that question later, but just acknowledging for the participants who's added that question there. But one of the other important points, once you really sort of raised is, using this, the carrot and stick, right? What do we use more? Should we just completely divest? Is that useful at all? Or do we find out ways to engage? And, of course, I mean, knowing that, how much private sector really contributes to global economy, and eventually, you do want, people do want employment, and, there are those livelihood issues that are related. And if you don't have those resources, how do you really help, how do you really sort of, also respect other economic, social, and cultural rights for which, for sending your children to school, you do need, you do need money, and that comes from your living wages or from your wages. So I think a lot of interesting points that you raised, and again, in the interest of the time, I'm going to move Surya to you, and thank you for your patience and listening to this very carefully. But Surya, we've often discussed, particularly, and I think this conversation came a couple of times today, is the limited purview of access to remedy, particularly in the existing standards and guidelines, including the UNGPs, right? I mean, we have looked at how the Pillar 3 remains one of the weakest pillars in terms of implementation, in terms of the implementations as well. And we know that rights holders, civil society is constantly looking for additional avenues. We just talked about, at the beginning on how benchmarking is one of those. I think Mans also sort of just mentioned about the shareholder activism as well. And we've been working together on this, developing these policy briefs, and with the Access to Justice Lab to sort of identify, some of these carrots and sticks that, if I could use the terminology, could use to, to also hold businesses accountable. So, given the, and I understand, we're looking at many more pressure points in this context, but given the focus of the session today, if you could, perhaps bring in the role of benchmarking as a pressure point to hold businesses accountable, but also, where do you see this being more effective as well? If you're looking at benchmarking, I mean, again, it's one pressure point. It may not result in, in really addressing and resolving everything. But where do you see the most value of benchmarking as a tool? Over to you, Surya.
Thank you, Harpreet. I hope you can hear me. So it's a pleasure to be joining this panel after 25 hours of journey from Sydney to Geneva. Let me start with the power imbalances that we have been talking about. And I think power imbalances relate to information, they relate to economic power, they relate to political connections between corporations on the one hand and the workers on the other hand. And these power imbalances are often not getting addressed in the human rights due diligence processes, unfortunately. And I think if you look at the findings of the benchmarks that were released today, they confirm that. Because if rights holders are not getting consulted in a meaningful manner, HRDD process, in fact, will perpetuate and make worse those power imbalances. And when it comes to access to remedy, because of these power imbalances, even if we have effective judicial or non-judicial mechanism available on paper, these victims may not be able to address those grievances through those mechanisms. So that again, issue about power imbalances. So what is the role of pressure points here? I think the pressure points are windows of engagement that allows us to look at the wider ecosystem of access to justice, not access to remedy, access to justice, because many of the issues we are dealing with are systemic issues, as other panelists also highlighted. So how do we use those systems? And powerful companies are powerful actors, but all powerful actors also have weaknesses. And in the context of multinationals, their weaknesses lie in some of the market aspects of it, investors, consumers, and how CSOs and media can create risk for these companies. And I think we can use these pressure points as a counterbalance to address those power imbalances. I think that is the key here that I would like to highlight. Now, more specifically in terms of the benchmarks, they are exploiting, in my view, the potential weaknesses or willingness of these companies to listen to investors, consumers, regulators, and CSOs, because they are part of the market forces. So they opportunities, they could be potential risks as well rewards. So both positive and negative dimension, risk versus reward. And some of these companies may be more receptive to risk. Some of them could be more receptive to rewards. And I think both these dimensions are crucial. So what a benchmark does, like CHRB, it puts companies on notice. It tells them that, look, if you make any commitment and you are not acting on those commitments, there are gaps. So if there are those gaps, then the market forces are likely to exploit those gaps. That's where it operates. But it also more importantly create what I will call the dialogue windows or engage. And those engagement windows could be between companies and consumers. Those could be between companies and investors. Those could be between companies and regulators. Those could be between companies and civil society organizations. And it has worked in the past to change corporate behavior through those practices. If I take two concrete examples, like CHRB has been concretely used in the past, for instance, by the Investors Alliance for Human Rights to approach several multinationals that they need to fix their issues in relation to human rights due diligence. So that's a concrete example. And some of those companies then have changed. I will also not name a company, but second example is that, and these will be mentioned in our policy briefs, Harpreet, that you mentioned, some of these case studies. And the second is a food product company, a multinational company in the US. And that was targeted based on CHRB ranking by the investors, that why your ranking is so poor. And that triggered some shareholder activism. And I think Mance mentioned some of those possibilities in terms of what investors can do. So I think we do not need to divest, but the threat of divesting is crucial. So I think there's a distinction between divesting and giving a threat to divest. So the pressure point is that we are not telling the company to divest, but we are using this pressure to bring the company to take the issue seriously and bring them to the discussion table. That's what the pressure point brings. It acts as a counterbalance to bridge the power imbalances that we have been talking about. I will stop here for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Surya. And in fact, I'm just going to pick, what you said, particularly in terms of, how benchmarks bring spotlight on companies. And really, then it's on companies to see, whether they want a positive spotlight or the negative spotlight. And we use that as a tool to also address the power imbalances, but also sort of look at, how do we encourage and open the windows for engagement across different stakeholders, at a larger multi-stakeholder level, but also sort of, within the two specific or exclusive stakeholders as well. And this again goes back to one of the questions I think that's been raised in the Q&A window here is what we're really talking about is, many of these tools or, many of these systems really, in some ways, really work for the global, large multinational companies, but not so much at the national level. And if you have any, Surya, just in terms of the follow-up question on that, if you have any reflections on how could we use, some of the indicators that we see, particularly on human rights and gender in the global documents or sort of in the global standards, how can we use some of those indicators, particularly in the national disclosures? And we've seen that, even at the national level, there's much more focus on disclosure. But how do we bring in those learnings from the global, from these global tools to the national level benchmarks or indices? Any specific lessons you think that people who are at the national level and advocating for change could use from these global tools?
It's an excellent question. I will try to be brief in responding, and we can have the discussion later if time allows. So CHRP and other benchmarks have been very powerful positive force. But my question is that how many workers in Bangladesh, how many investors in India, how many consumers in Thailand have heard of CHRP? Forget about using them. And I think that is where my next challenge is, and my next target is that I think we need to use the methodology of CHRP, and it's excellent that they make it open access and they allow others to use it, right? So I think the next stage should be that instead of just focusing on the global 100, top 100 companies, we need to localize these benchmarks. We need to go to each and every country and perhaps go in different sectors and use the same methodology to rank companies in different sectors in Bangladesh, in Nepal, in India, in Pakistan, in Malaysia, Thailand, so on and so forth. I think that would be a game changer. And that is where we could establish those networks of researchers and other students who could do this kind of a game-changing work, in my view, that would be quite relevant. In terms of lessons, what needs to change, in my view? One thing benchmarks need to do differently. This is very resource intensive, what I'm proposing, but they need to measure more what companies actually do. Most of the benchmarks are measuring and reporting and ranking companies in terms of what companies say they are doing, their public statement, their public commitments. They are not benchmarking and ranking what companies actually do. And I think in the next phase of benchmark, let us say 2.2 benchmark, should focus more in terms of what companies are actually doing it. That will be more resource intensive, but that will also be dynamic. The second suggestion I have is that we need to engage more the invisible. And by invisible, I mean the SMEs, the informal actors. If you look at the global South, South Asia, East Asia, 60 to 70 to 75 companies are informal economy, SMEs. Some of these are not even part of the supply chains of the global brands that we're talking about and ranking them. So how do we create less cumbersome benchmarks for SMEs? So these benchmarks are not part of the elite conversations. Rather, they are part of the conversations on the streets of Dhaka, Delhi, or Bangkok. I will stop at this for now. Thank you.
Thanks, Surya. And I hope colleagues from WBA are listening to some of these suggestions and recommendations. And let's see if I could also take the opportunity of adding, I think, the third way of looking at it is, perhaps, one of the conversation, in fact, we've been having at WBA is also if you could perhaps use and create or, sort of find out ways to do maybe even a master's, like a training for master trainers who could perhaps across universities or other institutions at the national level could use this methodology and then engage at the local level and the national level to be able to implement and sort of look at how do they then benchmark the local companies as well, but also engage with the disclosure processes at the country level. So I hope Namit and Sophia, you're listening to these suggestions as well. Milad, I'm just going to come to you because Surya, also brought in one of the other key aspects of imbalances, and this is really about, lack of engagement and lack of information. And in that context, I think the stakeholder engagement becomes a really, really crucial issue, but also it remains a gap for many, many companies. I think particularly in the supply chain, and especially with respect to being inclusive of diverse stakeholders such as women. And I understand that Amphori has done a lot of work, particularly, in bringing and really sort of, bringing in more diverse and inclusive diverse and inclusive workplace environment. So what according to you, perhaps can be done to change the situation, and what seems to have worked well in your experience, particularly in the context of stakeholder engagement? Milad, over to you.
Thank you, Harpreet. I think before we go into the question, let's clarify our understanding of what is a supply chain and what is stakeholder. I will read out something very word by word from the Wikipedia. When supply chain refers to the entire process of making and selling a commercial product, from the procurement of the raw materials to the delivery of the finished products to the end consumer. Whereas stakeholder is an individual, group, or organization that has an interest or concern in the outcomes of a particular initiatives and business. I think whoever is on the panel here and all our distinguished audience, I think everyone is from this business, so we all understand what are the meaning. But if you want me to tell you in a very short and simple way of understanding, I will say supply chain means all that are involved into from the order till shipment, in a very simple word. And if you ask me what is stakeholder, I would say anyone, everyone, directly, indirectly impacted by the business that we are into. So in a simple word, I represent Amphori. As you may know, its tagline is trade with purpose. I guess you will also know that Amphori is highly and genuinely committed to trade and sustainability. The new approach with ESG, working along the HREDD directives, Amphori has been working towards making its partners believe and perform in social, environmental, and economic benefits for everyone. I believe, to answer your question in a very short way, to bring all in one understanding and direction of sustainable trade, social dialogue is imperative. I think we need to bring in this discussion on the table, the discussion with the transparency that we referred before, the discussion with clarity that what are we aiming to gain from each other, bringing all in synergies and coordinated action from all concerned parties will help develop the industry and sustain into the business furthermore. I'll stop here, I guess. Over to you, Dr. Harpreet, if I've answered your question. Overall, I wanted to say is we need to come, listen to each other. We need to understand each other and bring in the culture of listening good. When we say that let's listen to each other, I think then only the gap between the suppliers and the stakeholders, everyone involved or not involved but impacted, will be able to take the benefit from going forward. Thank you, Dr.
Sure. Thanks, Milad. And Carla, one of the, I think, again, Milad just mentioned, in terms of the value of listening good and sort of, being engaging at different levels. And, considering particularly, you're specifically engaged with different global brands and, you're engaging with both the brands, but also the suppliers at the local level. Where do you see, particularly in the context of, some of these global developments that are taking place? And I think in this case, and I understand you do have a lot of experience, but, particularly looking at the German Supply Chain Due Diligence Act, but also the EU's Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. We've heard a lot of conversations taking place around CSDDD and its impact, particularly on the suppliers in the global south. How do you think suppliers are responding to these developments? But I think also my key question is, how do they become proactive? What does the suppliers in the global south need to do to be more proactive in their approaches? To be able to respond to, to be able to respond to some of these requirements that are going to come in hopefully, early next year. So if you could maybe just respond to that briefly, Carla, maybe 2 minutes.
Yeah, I'll try my best.
Let's try to do 3.
Okay, so I think what these legislations are actually doing is to create a level playing field, right? And that's also something that at least those brands who are already doing a lot and taking a lot of responsibility are appreciating. So that it's not longer a competitive disadvantage to really respect human rights and environmental standards in supply chains. And I think for the producers to be proactive, of course, first they need to have the awareness and the knowledge, as Surya also mentioned. I think that's the first step. And then some of the things that they could do in cooperating with the buyers, I think, relates to starting to do their own assessments of human rights and environmental risk in their own operations and their supply chains, and then also have a transparent communication. And that's very much relates to the point that Jennifer made in the panel before. That requires also, of course, then the buyers to be open to that and look into these issues and work with the suppliers on that, rather than just, withdrawing from the situation. So I think what's important is to really see it as a cooperative approach between brands and suppliers. And of course, that also relates to fair purchasing practices that we had already touched upon before in the discussion. Another point which I think is important for brands and suppliers is to have ways of meaningful engagement and dialogue with the workers and the communities. So the rights holders, which are really at the center of this legislation, so that they can take into account their voices also. So far I have seen here in our work in Bangladesh a lot of interest and openness from the industry to work on these issues. So that's of course very positive. At the same time, it has already been mentioned that there are also more systemic and challenging issues like wages or freedom of association, which cannot be addressed at the level of the individual factory. And there, I hope that we will see, cooperation between buyers, suppliers, and maybe also the worker representatives in the future to address this.
Sure. Thanks, Carla. And Surya, if I could be, if I could really sort of, ask you maybe to sort of take a minute or so. I think we're also sort of, we do, of course, are looking at, CSDDD and all of this legislative developments that are taking place as, perhaps in some ways, we are looking at that as a silver bullet and that it's really going to change. But what do you see, Surya, are the key challenges, particularly on, on the focus, or, suddenly there's so much attention on the legislative developments, but do you see any challenges in really changing the situation on the ground? And if so, what do you think? I know that could be another webinar in itself, but if you could perhaps take the last 2 minutes and use that also as your sort of concluding remarks as well before I move on to the other panelists. But before I hand it over to you, I'm receiving these requests from my colleagues here. Is that we're just about 5 minutes away from closing the sessions. If we could just go 5 minutes extra. And may I also use this opportunity to ask my colleagues to share also the feedback, like a brief survey for the session today and for the panel today. If you could share the details here, and if participants can also start, provide us feedback and responses on the survey, that would really be helpful for us. With that, Surya, over to you.
Thank you, Arpita. I think these legislation as well as soft standards are moving us in the right direction. But my view is at least that these standards or laws are not addressing the root causes of the human rights abuses linked to businesses. And I think we need to do more in terms of identifying those root causes and addressing those. For instance, how much profit brands are making out of the garments being manufactured in Bangladesh, and how much value the workers are reaping out of it. I think that is a fair question to ask. If a t-shirt is being sold in Europe for 45 euros, out of those 45 euros, who is getting how much? That is a question we should be asking as well. This is a key question that we should be addressing. We should also be asking a question about the pollution. The climate change, environmental impact is being suffered in the global south. And I think that also explains why, at least partly explains why Europe is so clean, because the factories are not there. So the consumers in Europe, the regulators and the governments in Europe have to bear that responsibility and try to address those systemic issues in the global south, not as charity, but as part of their responsibility. So I think we need to address those fundamental root causes in addition to focusing on UN guiding principles and CSDDD and all those things. And as some of you may know, I'm starting a new project in my role as the special rapporteur on business models for inclusive and sustainable development. So that project will look at some of those systemic issues, and hopefully there'll be some concrete solutions on the table in coming years. Thank you.
Thanks, Surya. We look forward to sort of looking at, how we can collaborate, but also sort of understanding, some of these new initiatives that are being undertaken. And with that, Mans, if I could just, ask you to perhaps, because, as an investor, you're also sort of investing in diverse sectors and industries. And, perhaps if you could see, how we can use or learn from the apparel sector, in some ways, I think Carla also did mention, in terms of how the garment sector or the apparel sector is slightly advanced than other sectors. But if you could, perhaps take the last 2 minutes of yours, also to use that as your concluding remarks is, what are some of the lessons perhaps that we can learn from the apparel sector for other sectors as well? And I'm particularly talking, for example, in the context of Bangladesh, where there's a lot more focus right now currently on diversification. So, we're looking at also the seafood industry, we're looking at leather, and we're looking at many other additional industries, to be advised to become export oriented. And if you look at that apparel sector and the journey that they've had, how can we use or how can we learn from the apparel sector and use that for other sectors as well? Over to you.
Yeah, thank you. And I just wanted to say I really like the comments Mr. Devadis did there about being practical and by trying to find solutions, because I think that is actually the way we need to look at it. It's very easy to focus on the issues, but we also need to find the solutions and try to encourage companies to adopt those solutions. And I think the apparel sector has certainly had its fair share of the scandals over time, and they keep happening for a number of reasons. But I also think that sector has gone through a fair bit of change. Maybe it is because ultimately those sectors are that sector is consumer facing, meaning that they need to be very careful about their brand. So it comes back to what I said previously about engaging. I think whenever we engage with a company, regardless of what the issue is, whether that's climate change, gender diversity, or labor rights issues in the supply chain, including in Bangladesh, what we try to find is, who's doing it really well? What is the global best practice? If you can ascertain that, and then you can try to encourage other companies to adopt exactly that. And I think on labor rights, companies can learn a lot from each other too. And similarly, when I look at other sectors, I certainly look at the apparel industry as a case study for things that have not worked so well and the things that have worked well. One thing I think is very clear to me after looking at this for many, many years is that the old model of pre-announced regular social audits of factories, they're not necessarily going to find the issues. They're a snapshot in time, and I think they need to be complemented by things like worker hotlines. I think the Amada Kotha helpline in Bangladesh, I think that's a good example of something which other industries can learn from as well. I've actually had engagements with electronics retailers saying, couldn't you do something similar to the Bangladeshi garment industry? Where we have an NGO that's effectively running a worker helpline where workers can report things anonymously. I think that's a great example. And also some companies use worker focus groups, so they meet with workers outside the factory environment. And so there's a lot of learnings, I think, from the apparel sector. And another one is traceability of cotton. Without going into where cotton is made and various forced labor issues with that. The cotton industry is obviously, or the cotton supply chain, I should say, is a very complex and long supply chain. But there are ways you can you can get around that, the transparency issue, for instance, by using forensic analytical tools where you trace the isotopes of a certain cotton fiber to see where it's made. It's expensive, but at least it works. And then unions is another great example. I think if I look at all the really bad incidents that's happened in Bangladesh, as far as I'm concerned, they've always had one thing in common, and that's been lack of union involvement in those factories. That's another great learning for other industries as well. And then what else? I'm just going to sort of try to gain some time here. Yeah, I think there's being practical. I think that's really, really key. Try to find what works, try to write it down and collate those ideas and use those for other sectors too. That's how we work as investors. I have actually co-published something called the Investor Toolkit on Human Rights, which is publicly available. It's done through the Responsible Investment Association Australasia. I'm happy to share that in the chat later on. But that's exactly what we're trying to do, like just try to find a win-win situation for workers, companies, and investors, and try to encourage companies to adopt those. Because ultimately, I think companies that truly focus on human rights issues, they also understand they need to nurture long-term relationships with the suppliers. And I've heard a lot of complaints from both suppliers and brand companies. And I think one thing that disturbed me a bit when I went to Bangladesh this time was that many retailers talk a big game about responsible sourcing, but and they have a lot of demands on factory owners in Bangladesh. I know that much. At the same time, they want to lower the price. So I'm just thinking, how sustainable is that equation? Where you, on the one hand, ask suppliers to install solar panels on the rooftops to sort of decarbonize their supply chain and invest in various things, and then at the same time we would have a lower price. I think one of the issues in the corporate world is that you have different key performance indicators or KPIs between procurement on the one hand and then responsible sourcing individuals on the other. If they are not the same, I think that's always going to put suppliers in a difficult space. So that would be my concluding remark. Like, look at what's working. Try to find. I mean, there's no company out there that's perfect, but there's certainly a lot of good practices, and I think everyone can learn from those. Try to look at those, and then I think that's the best way forward. It's almost like a bottom-up approach. So rather than having wholesale systemic changes, I think if companies actually looked at what works and there's a business case for that, it's not like you're going to harm your profits by doing so. In actual fact, it's probably the opposite. And if you can find those cases, of which there are many, that's what we should focus on.
Sure. Thanks. Sure. Thanks, Mans. In fact, I was just going to ask if you could share the link to the Investors Toolkit, and we will share that with the participants after the webinar when we send out email after the session today. But really want to take an opportunity to thank all of you for joining this important discussion today. I think we've tried to respond to some questions, but also we have raised many more questions today. But again, I think it was said in the beginning that it's a continuing conversation, and we have started this process, but let's see, also find out and identify ways where we can coordinate and collaborate with each other and take this journey together and forward. So thank you everyone for joining us today. I do want to take last 2 minutes also just to thank the team that has really been working very hard to get this together. I mean, as we said, initially it was supposed to be an in-person event, and now we've moved to sort of a virtual event. And Amy, if you could perhaps also just share, thank you for putting that code online, but if you could also just provide us feedback. Well, I'm just going to go on my thanking speech. Thank you very much to all the panelists who joined us today. But really a big thanks to Namit and Sophia and other colleagues from the World Benchmarking Alliance, for they've been working very hard to put this together, as well as to my other colleagues, Mehruna Chaudhry, Amy Selmer, Suparak Vesarat, Oli, and Mehruna, who've been working us to sort of bring this event together. Last but not the least, I would also like to acknowledge the support that's been provided by our event management agency, Asiatic, and who were very adaptive and moved on to kind of really take it from hybrid to a fully virtual event. But thank you everyone for joining us today. We will share the PowerPoints. We will share some of the other documents and the resources that were mentioned today, but also the key summary findings from this. And we look forward to this continuing conversations with all of you. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
And last but not the least, I would also like to thank the Generation Foundation as well as Government of Sweden for their continued support to us to be able to bring, not just this event together, but for us to be able to do all the important work I think that we're doing in terms of developing these documents and benchmarks. So thank you very much for the generous support to us.